Chicago downtown pickup, Friday night, October 12, 2018. I never imagined that 3 ordinary rides in one shift would remake the way I think about cars, strangers, and the thin line between life and something else. I was behind the wheel for money and for the quiet between fares, a way to keep my head from spinning after a messy breakup and a layoff that left my schedule wide open. I took shifts for the routine, for the playlists, for the small talk that felt like steadying breaths. The city smelled like wet concrete and roasted nuts that evening, lights reflecting in puddles, the app vibrating like a pulse I had learned to trust. I wanted extra cash and time to think, not to learn how to handle a body in the backseat. I remember the car, a gray Toyota with a faint burn mark near the cup holder, the scent of peppermint air freshener, and a blanket with a dog hair or two. I remember the app confirming pickups and the GPS route that stitched neon points together. The first passenger was a young man named Tom with a hoodie and a backpack. The second, a woman who smelled of lemon and carried a violin case. And the final request that night came in like any other. A ping 2 blocks away, a timer ticking down, a location under an overpass. Those 3 rides looked ordinary from the outside. That is what made the moment impossible to slot into my memory. Normal was a skin, it peeled away. The shift started calm. Horns, the barista across the street calling to a customer, someone laughing in a doorway. I checked my mirror, adjusted the seat, and drove to the first pickup at a corner where a street vendor sold roasted corn. The city was busy with a steady crisscross of headlights and pedestrians. I passed a man in a fluorescent vest carrying a clipboard, a woman with a child asleep against her shoulder, a group of late-shift nurses swapping jokes. Maria, another driver who worked the same neighborhood, waved as she idled. I texted her later that night, "You getting the late rush too?" We traded small updates about surge pricing and where the best late-night coffee was hiding. The app kept sending requests like splashes, light and quick, and I answered them because that is how nights like this are built. I remember the soft scrape of the leather seat as Tom slid in, the beep of the seatbelt latch, the faint metallic scent of his backpack zipper. The radio played a slow song, and the city hummed outside. We slid into conversation the way people do in cars. Tom was quiet at first, a student with an overnight bag, voice low and precise. He asked if I knew a shortcut, and I told him yes and rerouted. We spoke about classes, about a professor who gave out too much homework, about pizza places that stayed open. He was small-handed, with a laugh that arrived late in his chest. When I dropped him off near a dorm, he thanked me, tipped $5, and said, "I owe you one." I watched him walk away under a sodium lamp, hoodie up, backpack slung low. The violin case passenger booked next had a name tag stitched inside that read, "Alina," and she hummed scales under her breath as I drove her downriver. She told me about rehearsals and about how she played for weddings to pay rent. She had a steady, practiced calm that made the car feel like a practice room. I thought the night would keep that low-key rhythm. Then the third ping came. It was 11:47 p.m., and the address was a curb under the Kennedy overpass, the strip of streetlights that throws a rectangle of light and leaves the rest in shadow. The app said, "Pick up from a user named Martin." The map bubble pulsed as I pulled to the curb. The location had a smell of cold metal and the distant tang of gasoline. A man waved with one hand the way someone would hail a cab, pale in the underpass light. He climbed in without looking at me long enough to say hi. He smelled like old cologne and disinfectant. He said, "Drive," and his voice was softer than I expected. The ride started like any other, but there was an odd stillness behind him that I first attributed to tiredness. The back window caught a streak of an ambulance light that went by 2 blocks over, and a dog barked in the distance. I checked the GPS, and the route back to the north side looked straightforward. I asked him where he was heading, and he mumbled the address. He did not take out his phone. 15 minutes into the drive, the car felt wrong. I noticed the way his shoulders slumped, the jaw slack, and the smell that was harder to place as anything other than a sickness. I asked, "You okay back there?" and he did not answer. I thought he was sleeping until, at a red light, I turned and saw his head leaning forward at an odd angle, neck loose, eyelids pale. My stomach went cold. I touched the back of my seat, called out his name. No response. The heater hissed. The streetlight cast a sodium rectangle over his profile, and I saw a wetness at the corner of his mouth that looked like drool, and then like something else. I fumbled for my phone, hit the emergency call, and dialed 911. At the same time, I opened the door and leaned back and touched his wrist to check for a pulse. No pulse. My hands were on his skin, and it felt cool and slightly sticky. The breath I had been holding since the pickup exhaled sharply and then hung in the car like a fog. The next 10 minutes stretched and crumpled. I called the dispatcher on the app and spoke to Kevin, my contact at the fleet subgroup that monitored incidents, who said, "Stay put, stay safe," and the app would flag the ride. I flagged the ride as an emergency. A bystander named Marcus came from the sidewalk and banged on my window, asking what was happening. I told him I thought the passenger was dead. He looked at me the way the city looks at accidents sometimes, like a piece of news you do not want to be real. I told Elena, who had just left, to call the police. She had already dialed. The app sent an automatic message to the company with the GPS coordinates. The siren that passed by in the distance pulled away and then doubled back. I could see the red and blue flicker through the windshield. The air inside the car was thick with the metallic perfume of fear. "Are you sure he is not breathing?" Marcus asked, his voice high. I checked his wrist. I said, "No pulse. He's cold." "Call 911 now," he said, pressing his forehead to the glass. "I already did," I said. "Dispatcher is on the app." "Do you know him?" he asked. "No," I said, "not even his last name. The app shows Martin, but that is all I have." "Okay, stay in the car," he said. "Do not touch anything." He was already pulling a jacket around his hands like a shield. The EMTs arrived fast, 2 units from the city service with fluorescent jackets that glowed under the underpass. An EMT named Sarah knelt in the street and leaned into the back seat while Officer Ramirez from the local precinct took notes and photographed the scene. I answered their questions like a machine, my voice small but steady. I told them the pickup time, the route, my interactions. They lifted the passenger onto a board and checked his pupils. The coroner said, "Cold and rigid, lips without a flicker of color." Sarah asked me to step to the sidewalk and to give a full statement. Kevin from the app called again to check my status and to tell me the ride would be canceled and flagged for review. The police told me to remain available and not to delete any messages or GPS logs. I watched as a body bag was zipped in the back of the ambulance and felt, absurdly, that the car where I had spent hours listening to playlists had become a tiny morgue. There were 8 to 10 exchanges of direct questions and answers in real time with the officers and paramedics. Officer Ramirez asked, "Did you touch him?" I said, "Just his wrist." He asked, "Did he smell of alcohol?" I said, "No distinct smell, just like someone sick." He asked, "Any ID?" I said, "I did not see any." He asked, "Did you pick him up under the bridge?" I said, "Yes, at 11:47.
Pum. He asked, "Was there blood?" I said, "Not until he was moved, then I noticed some staining at the mouth." He asked, "Any idea who he could be?" I said, "No." He asked, "Did you notice any injury?" I said, "No." He asked, "Did anyone else see you put him in the car?" I said, "Elena saw me drive away and Marcus saw me pull over." He asked, "Did you exchange words?" I said, "He said drive once and mumbled the rest." Those exchanges were practical and blunt, and they piled into my head like stones. The procedures the police followed were methodical and clinical. The officers taped off the curb and marked the vehicle position with cones. The EMTs followed a confirm and pronounce protocol, then directed the coroner to assume custody. The patrol officer took my statement on a recorded device and asked specific times and phrases to lock the log. The car was photographed extensively, inside and out. Evidence techs took swabs from the upholstery and bagged the passenger belongings in individual tamper-evident envelopes. My app data, GPS trace, and messages were downloaded and preserved. The driver's side door handle and the seatbelt latch were swabbed for prints. I was told not to accept any offers from strangers and to keep my phone and the car accessible until an investigator told me otherwise. An evidence technician explained chain of custody into a small notebook and then typed the same into a tablet for the records. The entire technical explanation fit into a compact 90-second briefing about documentation and preservation, and later that would be written into the formal report. Word spread by the time the coroner loaded the body. A reporter from a local station, called Jenna, took pictures from across the street and later asked if I would speak on camera. People on adjacent curbs whispered theories. The ride app company issued a canned statement through Kevin that said they were cooperating with authorities and offering counseling to the driver. Social media picked up the image of my license plate and a thread grew overnight about safety, about whether drivers should carry pulse oximeters or body cams, about whether apps needed an emergency button that called the police directly. The next morning, the local news labeled the incident mysterious and added phrases like sudden death and pending toxicology. Marcus posted a photo of the scene with a short caption, and it got shared more than either of us expected. Calls from lawyers and from concerned family members started coming in by midday. There were 3 creepier rides before and after that night, small threads that braided into a larger fear. 2 weeks earlier, a woman named Leela rode with me from a funeral and kept talking about shadows on the highway and how she felt followed by an old man who rode in silence at the back of the church van. She insisted she had seen the man in 3 separate pews, and that his eyes looked like glass. We argued, and I said maybe grief is doing the work of ghosts. She tapped my arm and said, "Not everything that marks our lives is living." On another run, a man named Jason in a suit whistled the same 3 notes over and over in the back seat, like a cold lullaby. And when I asked him if he was nervous, he smiled and his teeth were too white. Each of those rides left an aftertaste like metal. They were coincidences until they were not. The final ride that night made me reframe them all. The backstory that led me to that night is as plain as worn seat fabric and as complicated as a city skyline. I was 32, had grown up in the suburbs and moved to the city for the way buildings lean together like friends. I drove for multiple companies for 3 years. I worked night shifts most weeks to pay off a medical debt and to afford a small studio that had winters so cold the pipes rattled. My father had been an EMT for 25 years, and then he retired with his hands shaking. He showed me which part of the job kept you whole and which parts broke you. My mother taught me to notice small things, like how people hold their coffee cups when they are lying. The breakup of the year before had left me with a pile of selfie habits and a playlist of songs about leaving. I drove because I loved the small stories that accumulated, the lives that briefly intersected in my rearview. I had a habit of keeping a notebook clipped to the visor where I jotted odd lines passengers said. That night, the notebook stayed closed. I was a driver who believed in simple rules. Be polite, keep receipts on file, stay on well-lit streets when you can. I had completed a safety course offered online by the rideshare company about de-escalation and about calling for help because you never knew. I had been trained to check the app for flags and to ask for ID if a rider seemed odd. But you cannot anticipate everything. You cannot prepare your hands for the shape of a dead weight. Some things you only learn in a small car with the window steamed up and an ambulance light washing the dashboard. My backstory explained why I called the police and why I refused to move the passenger. It explained why I called my father in the morning to tell him I had been in a scene he had seen 1,000 times and that I needed a minute to breathe. It explained why, later, I refused offers to be interviewed on live television without counsel. There were at least 5 other named people who mattered that night and later in the narrative. Maria, who waved at the start of the shift and who later sent me a text offering to pick up my next fares. Marcus, the bystander, who banged the window and stayed until the officers arrived and who later sat with me on the curb while I smoked a cigarette I did not want.
Kevin, the dispatcher in the Fleet app who coordinated the initial response and filed the app records. Officer Ramirez, who took my statement and who had been a cop long enough to say quiet things into his notebook. EMT Sarah, who knelt on the pavement with a practiced calm and who later called to check on me. Reporter Jenna, who called the next morning for my comment and then wrote a piece that focused on the normalness of the car. I mention each of them because each had an action and reaction that shaped the sequence of events. They were witnesses, actors, and anchors. 3 moments of tension sit in my memory like bright bruises, and each of them deserves a fuller telling. The first came when I realized the passenger was not breathing and I placed my hand against his wrist. For a full minute, the world narrowed to the texture of skin, the slow tapping of a single car door across the street, and the sound of my own pulse that I had to choke down. Time folded in on itself as I dialed and waited and held nothing. The second moment came when the coroner zipped the bag and I watched him lift a corner to peek and then close it. I had a sudden, childish urge to look inside, because for a moment I thought if I looked long enough, something would move. The third moment of tension arrived when the news trucks came, and a woman shouted that the app should be banned for safety, and the crowd pushed, and someone in the crowd slipped and banged his head. And for 2 minutes, the whole curb was a lit storyboard of panic. Each of those moments lasted long enough to smell and taste and remember in tactile detail, and each forced me to make choices about what to say, how to behave, and how to protect myself. I will expand the first tension scene in the car into 2 concise paragraphs to give the detail it deserves. The wetness at the mouth looked like spilled coffee until I saw it darken into something older. The heater clicked once and then fell silent, and my lungs felt like they were learning to breathe for the first time. My hands shook when I touched his wrist. The artery throbbed faintly against my fingers once and then stopped. In the silence, I could hear the tires on the bridge a block away, the faint tinkle of a toy somewhere in a building, a laugh too far to belong to anyone in the present. I looked for a pulse under the jaw, the carotid, and felt only a slackness that did not belong to sleep. I called 911. The colors of the world shifted to those of emergency lights. My mouth tasted metallic. I thought of my father telling me to check the airway and to call out the status clearly so the dispatcher could send help. I said, "We have a passenger unresponsive, not breathing," and then repeated the address. The second tension moment compressed into memory the instant the body bag closed. The coroner moved with the professional slowness of someone whose job is to make endings orderly. He zipped the bag, and the sound was small and final. I remember thinking, unrealistically, that if I could just move the bag, it might not be true. Officer Ramirez asked for my badge number, and I almost handed him a credit card by mistake. A neighbor filmed the reserve ambulance door closing on a phone, and the light of the screen made a white rectangle in the dim. I learned then how public a small private death can become when the city decides to look. The reaction of the crowd was a low murmur that kept trying to shape itself into questions. What happened? Who was he? Why was he in the back seat? Each question landed like a pebble on the water and rippled outward. The third tension moment was at the curb when a woman from the crowd started to scream that rideshare companies were dangerous and that the city should ban them. Her voice grew into a chorus, and for a second that chorus drowned out the paramedics who were still finishing their work. Someone accused me of reckless driving, and a man wearing a suit said I should have seen the signs. I felt small and enormous at the same time. A teenage boy asked me if the man had been texting, and when I said I did not know, he nodded as if that explained everything. The crowd created a narrative, and I became its protagonist, whether I wanted to be or not. I had to decide in that moment to hand my phone to Officer Ramirez, to stop answering public calls, and to find a friend to sit with me. I asked Maria to pick up my next fares, and she showed up with coffee and earbuds and a blank space to sit. The external investigation unfolded over the following days, with a methodical mix of empathy and procedure. Officers from the local precinct took the basic report and forwarded digital data to the detective unit. The city medical examiner collected tissues for toxicology testing and ran a battery of tests to determine cause of death. The rideshare company compiled logs of the GPS route and timestamps and placed an internal hold on my account while they reviewed the incident. Kevin told me that protocol required them to preserve the ride details and to provide counseling to any driver involved in a death. The coroner requested consent to test for drugs and for medical history checks. My phone records were scrutinized, and the app alerted other drivers in the area with a safety note. News outlets called and ran variations of the story. I was named in a few headlines simply as the driver. A detective named Lewis interviewed me twice and asked precise questions about the sequence of events and why I had not driven the passenger to a hospital. I explained I had checked for a pulse and then called 911, and I insisted I had not moved the body. The technical explanation of evidence handling and police procedure that I was given later by Detective Lewis was compact and procedural. He told me that any potential biological evidence would be collected by a forensic technician wearing gloves and packaged in sterile containers to avoid contamination. The vehicle would be inventoried and photographed, and any digital files, including GPS traces and app logs, would be copied and secured in a case file. The coroner would document time of death as best as possible and order toxicology screens, and the chain of custody would be documented on every item as it moved from scene to lab to storage. Those sentences fit neatly in a report and later into the paper article. But in the moment they were recited, they felt like a promise that the incident would be treated with the caution of a laboratory and not just as gossip. Public reaction split into social tension and personal outreach. The story trended for 2 days with heated comments about driver safety and the need for vehicles to have cameras. Some commenters accused me of hiding something. Others thanked me for doing the right thing. A crowdfunding page sprang up that promised to help with counseling costs, and a woman who called herself Molly offered to bring me soup. The rideshare company gave me a week off with pay and offered free therapy sessions through their employee assistance program. Marcus sent me a message asking if I wanted to come to a coffee and talk about what he had seen. Maria insisted I take her shift for a night while I sorted my head. Officer Ramirez called twice to let me know the investigation was moving forward and to ask if I needed anything. The city issued a brief statement about the incident, and the police cautioned against speculation pending toxicology results. The investigation eventually returned a medical cause that the medical examiner labeled probable cardiac arrest with contributing factors pending toxicology. The results identified a combination of prescription medication and alcohol that had likely depressed respiratory function. There was no criminal conduct found linked to the death, and the county closed the case as unattended death after toxicology and medical records review. It was a relief and a letdown. The story that had roared through phones and feeds found its closure in a cold paragraph of a report. Some people, however, refused to accept a medical end and continued to speculate about foul play. I do not know why some. People need conspiracy to feel proximate to a tragedy. After the official clearance, the challenge was to live inside a body that had been present during a death and to work a car that was the site of that ending. I drove less for a few weeks. When I did pick up passengers, I noticed the micro-expressions people make when they try to be normal in a confined space. I noticed phones held like shields and jokes cracked too quickly. I carried a small kit of water bottles and clean towels and a notepad that now had the siren that night scribbled in the margin. I learned to set filters on my social media and to avoid the station that had filmed the curb. I started wearing a band on my wrist that said "breathe" because some days I felt the world compress into my throat, and it helped to press against something tangible. 1 month after the incident, I could write a short, practical update. I had met with a counselor through the rideshare company, and we worked through basic coping strategies. I took a week off driving to sleep and to visit my sister in the suburbs. Marcus and I had coffee, and he said he felt the same hum in his body when he walked past the underpass. Maria drove with me for an evening, and we shared notes on handling ride refusals and on how to use the app's built-in safety features. The coroner had called to say that toxicology was complete and that the cause of death was likely natural but with complicating substances. I learned that the man had no identification on him at the time of pickup and that it took 2 days to confirm his identity through dental records. The city had a small op-ed calling for better emergency integration in rideshare apps, and the company responded with a plan to add an easily accessible emergency button in the next quarter. I felt some relief that the incident resulted in a tangible change, even small. 3 months after the night under the overpass, the neighborhood felt different. People walked with an extra caution. There was a small memorial of flowers taped to the base of a street sign near where I had pulled over, and someone had left a single pair of gloves on the guardrail. I attended a community meeting where drivers and city officials discussed safety on nighttime routes. I testified about the need for clearer protocols and a faster line to emergency dispatch. The rideshare company had launched a pilot program for optional in-car cameras for drivers who wanted them. I debated installation for a long time and finally agreed because I wanted the protection of an objective record. My father came by and we ate quiet sandwiches, and he told me how to keep a steady voice when asked questions. The press had moved on, but the changes remained in small technical ways, and in the nervous habit of checking the app more than once before going to a pickup. 6 months on, the city had adjusted in small bureaucratic ways, and my own life had bent and reformed. I was driving again regularly and had picked up some steady customers who recognized me by name. I had installed a small dash camera and had signed a waiver that placed footage in the cloud. The payment for counseling had closed the gap on the bill that had worried me the week after the incident. The community meeting resulted in a group of drivers who texted each other in a safety chain when someone did a late-night ride in a sketchy area. The memory of the man in the back seat did not fade, but it moved from a raw edge to a slow ache. I taught a brief class for new drivers on de-escalation and survival, and I told them to always call for help and to document carefully. Some days I still woke with the image of his slack jaw at the red light, and I would press my fingers to my wrist to remind myself I was still here. In a small memorial a week after the death, a group of drivers and a few neighbors placed a candle and a note that read, "Rest easy, stranger." The rideshare company provided a small stipend toward funeral costs once the family was located. There was no trial, no dramatic reveal on primetime television, just a series of procedural motions, and a family getting a call that their relative had been found. I sometimes think about how small the city can make a person anonymous until a story demands a name. The end of the legal process did not erase the feeling that the world is fragile in tiny moments like locking a car door or choosing a route through a shadowed underpass. There was a practical lesson that stuck. Keep your hands available to help, to check, to call, and to hold the notebook open. There was an emotional lesson as well. Death can enter a life as quietly as a man slipping into the back seat and not letting anyone know he was leaving. I learned to listen to the city the way my mother taught me to notice how people hold their cups when they are lying. I learned to be light-handed with my judgments and to be rigorous with my documentation. I learned also to accept that some answers come wrapped in late technical reports, while other answers never arrive. If you have ever been shaken by a ride like this, or by a small public crisis, please share in the comments a line about what you felt, when, and where. Start with, "I was in my car," or "I was on a train." Then the month and a single sentence about the feeling. It helps to name the moment. If you drive for a ride like this, or by a small public crisis, please share in the comments. I was in my car. Then the month. And a single sentence. The feeling. It helps to name the moment. Living, consider installing a dash camera and registering for the company counseling when they offer it. If you are a passenger, know that your presence matters and that quick action can change outcomes. If this story moved you and you want more first-hand accounts and careful reporting about these kinds of incidents, consider subscribing. We make these stories to understand the small ways our lives brush against danger and to offer a space where survivors and witnesses can be heard. I left the final line of this account like a hinge. The city keeps turning, and so do the wheels of our cars. For me, the memory sits like a soft object in my pocket, always there when I reach in, a reminder that normal can be fragile and that staying present with strangers may be the only thing between a quiet ride and something that changes everything. If this story touched you, leave a comment and consider subscribing for more true accounts told with care and detail.